The following program is part 2 of 2 parts, each part an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
Okay, this is a young tree. I think it's 2 years old in my yard. And this is being pruned with hedge shears. Real simple. And it's so easy that you wonder why it's so easy. But anyway, this new growth is about 2 to 3 feet long. It's being cut in half. Again, I mentioned late April. And this would probably be the July timing. Cut it in half. And then, of course, new shoots are going to grow pretty vigorously from that. So then you have to cut it off again later.
So why was there any fruit on that tree?
It's a young tree, 2 years. It's the second year. There may have been fruit down here, but if you notice, this is pretty thick, and all that's getting shaded down there. It's a problem. So you have to keep it open, keep it opened up. Yes?
You said you might cut it again in September. Would you be cutting off for next year's fruit then, or is it just half?
If it's a young tree, yes, you could cut it off again in September. You'd be cutting it off higher. But what I'm talking about on cutting late is on mature trees, where you have the tree established at 6 feet, and you have new growth that you're cutting off each time, and I'm going to get to that. But then if you cut it off the last time in July, you get new shoots come, and those have flower buds that have fruit. And sometimes that, I mean, I've had it happen where that's the only fruit on the tree, so you want to leave it, but then it starts to shade even more down below. I'm not real satisfied with fruit bushes in some respects, but it seems to work okay. Okay, mature fruit bushes. So you have your tree established, like I mentioned, then you cut back the new growth above the selected tree height 2 to 3 times during the growing season. Ed Livo says 2 times. I say 3 times on vigorous trees. Now, a lot of homeowners, maybe they don't water enough or the soil's compacted. 2 times might be enough because they just don't have enough growth. Use thinning cuts again for sunlight penetration. Okay, this is at the Horticulture Center. This is this row of trees at 2 feet apart. And you notice this plum tree back here? The cherries were, for some reason, growing much slower. And that's exactly what you want, where the growth is maybe 6, 7 inches. On plums, man, you get 100 shoots growing each at about 100 miles an hour. It's just so fast. And all that growth is totally shading out anything below. So the next step is, guess what? Prune. It's not the same camera angle, but you can see the difference there. And so now you have sunlight reaching the permanent portion of the tree. It's been pruned on the side also. And then thinning cuts were made also. And this is what it looks like on the top of the tree. You can use shears, but at one point they get so thick that you have to use loppers. Or we're going to get a hedge trimmer and really get it done quickly. Because we have so many trees now that it's hard to do the manual pruning on them. But this is kind of a no-no in terms of, in pomology, you don't think of doing all these heading cuts. It's kind of a bad thing. But if it sunburns up here, that's okay. It's the top of the tree. It's not like a main scaffold branch. And then that bud right there, that bud, those are going to grow really, really fast now. But it'll take them a couple of weeks to really start growing. This is a cherry after it started growing, after it was cut. See the new vigorous upright growth, and it shades a lot. But you keep that trimmed off and keep it opened up, and it's okay. This is one of those cherry fruit bushes at Dave Wilson Nursery. Pretty nice looking, and it does produce fruit. Not as much fruit. That's the big thing. If you really like a lot of fruit, you probably shouldn't use a fruit bush. And if you like to sit under a shade tree, you probably shouldn't make a fruit bush. For those 2 reasons, I like the bigger tree. But I have a ladder. I can get up on the ladder. You know, when you're healthy, it works. But a lot of people, they're older and their health isn't as good. It's hard to get up on ladders, and this method could give them a way to grow some fruit. But you don't get as much fruit except Asian pears. Some trees are just really well suited to this method. Asian pear, apple, and pears are really well suited to it. And plums also. Now apricots form a lot of spurs But for some reason, both at my house and at the horticulture center, there's very few flower buds that form. I can't figure out why, except the tree is responding to so much growth being cut off twice. I don't know. But Ed Livo says at Dave Wilson Nursery they get a lot of fruit on their apricot bushes. I haven't figured it out yet. But some trees are really well suited. Now peaches require longer shoots, and so if you're cutting all those shoots off, there's a potential to have less fruit. But after a while, I've noticed on these fruit bushes, the peach shoots become much shorter. They just don't grow as much and they're being cut off. And so most of your fruit is produced on these short shoots, which there's still fruit there, so it's okay. But works really well on Asian pears. This is my house, and see, I've got fruit trees planted every 3 feet, and now I'm getting ready to take out every other one because I was not happy with 3 feet apart. I think trees need a little bit more room, but it can work, and it has worked. It's just, it happens that every other tree isn't the best tree in the world, so I'm going to take them out. So this is what it looked like. I don't know if it was the next summer, or that same summer, or not, or the following summer, but early on, just incredible amounts of growth. If your soil is real deep, if your watering is good, if you use mulch, you can get really good growth, too much growth in fact. And so it's so much growth that I haven't really been happy with 3 feet apart. I think 4 feet should be a minimum. Okay, and notice I get into it. I like these branches bent out, so in order to do that you have to use string and bend them out. Otherwise everything was wanting to grow straight up, so you bend them out and then you have a nice rounded fruit bush. And it was neat. This is an area that's long and it's up, raised up. Here's the walkway. It's raised up about 4 feet. It's kind of neat to look up into your trees. So you have these narrow areas along a fence, and you could easily grow fruit bushes along it. Okay, the advantages of fruit bushes: the tree is maintained without a ladder. That's the key advantage. Another is you have trees for small spaces and sequential ripening. So if you have room for just one tree, you could either have one big tree and let it get out of hand, or if you like to prune, you have a ladder, you can prune it. That's a good way to grow a tree, open center or central leader. But you could do it by keeping the tree small. And if you do that, then all of a sudden you're doing the thinning, you're doing the pruning, you're doing pest management. You can do those, whereas a tree gets really tall, what do? A lot of people just don't have the equipment to deal with tall trees. The disadvantages though: less fruit, no shade for sitting under, and the timing of the pruning is really critical. This is an apricot that was pruned to 6 feet right here, and then this growth came, as I mentioned, and this is what I was talking about. This growth came after the last pruning in late July, and that's the new growth set the flower buds in that last summer. The next year those turned into flowers and fruit. And those were the only fruit we got on this whole apricot tree. And most of our apricot trees we didn't get fruit on. Has anybody tried this with apricot? Have a similar result? Okay. Anyway, so we didn't want to prune all this off. We waited until it was ripe, we picked the fruit, then we cut it off. Potentially that could produce a lot of shading down low. But,
what did that fruit, the tree do the next year?
What did the tree do the next year? Well, we kept those upper shoots off, so it didn't do this. It didn't have fruit.
Again, no fruit.
It would have this year, would have had a lot of fruit. We had a lot of buds finally the 4th year, but because we had low chill, all those buds dried up and died. We had very, very little fruit. We're just having a struggle with apricots. Okay, another problem, this is that same Santa Rosa plum tree that Art Sveda was standing by. What happened was they got busy, as we all do. The shoots grew and grew and grew and kept growing, and it wasn't until July or August that they got to their first pruning. What does that mean? Totally shaded over. Everything down here dies out, and that's a really good example of what can happen if you miss a pruning. Whereas if you miss a pruning with a standard tree, it's not the end of the world. Close, but not quite. So finally it was pruned off, and then all this is exposed to sunburn, and it'll start growing quickly, but if it was really, really hot for several days, you could get some burning on the branches. Okay, espalier. I'm really getting intrigued with espalier. They use it a lot in Europe. We're using it more here now, but it's fairly expensive in orchards. But I'm really pleased with this method, and it's good in a narrow stretch along a house or a fence. This is a picture from a book, and you see the shoots are trained out. Usually you let the shoot grow a while and then bend it down. If you bend it down, sometimes it'll stop growing. That's the nature of bending branches. They stop growing. So you have to be a little careful on that, but if it stops growing, you cut it off, and it'll send a shoot up, let it grow, and then bend it down. And you have fruit all along only here, and you remove everything else that's growing up during the summer. See the leaves on those? They're removed during the summer. And it's kept nice and narrow so that the sun can reach the lower branches too. And interesting, they have maybe fewer fruit down here, and that's what will happen because it gets less light. You get the most fruit up here, and that's why you have to keep this the narrowest on the top so it gets more light down below. Okay, apples and pears work best for espalier. Use whenever possible semi-dwarf. In apples, it's really nice. There are lots of semi-dwarfing rootstocks. And the best one is M111, M as in mother, 111. And a lot of the trees that are sold now in the nurseries are on M111 because they are dwarfing. We're really fortunate in apples to have good dwarfing rootstocks. And then plant them 6 to 15 feet apart. That's quite a wide spacing, wide range. So it doesn't really matter. You can plant them pretty close. You can plant them pretty far away. Use 2 to 4 wires spaced about 2 feet or more apart vertically. And train the main shoots along the wires and head the upright shoots to 3 buds during the growing season. And that produces spurs. So as the shoot grows and it gets about a foot long or less, cut it off to 3 buds and you'll get new growth come from that. But because it's a semi-dwarf, it won't just produce all this real vigorous stuff. If it was a standard plum or peach or apricot, those shoots that would grow from that shoot that was cut to 3 buds would just take off. But on apple, they form spurs, and it's really nice. All those, except for maybe the top bud, the shoot that grows might be vigorous, but then you just cut it off again, and they form spurs for good fruiting. And then use thinning cuts in the winter to reduce the number of spurs. And I have our tree from the Horticulture Center that was pruned through much of the summer, but it got left a little bit long, and that's okay, but it's not too long. But see, this amount of growth you can handle. If it becomes 3 or 4 feet, then it's a problem. But, okay, so this is before pruning, and next would be after pruning. And let's see if we can see what happened. This branch was cut here. That was removed. I believe that was cut off altogether. This was cut actually up in here. This was cut. This was cut. So you can get an idea where we're almost doing a grapevine type thing where you leave spurs. And the spurs formed here are natural spurs. We're not creating spurs like in grapes. Okay? So all these nice little round things at the tips are flower buds. And those buds will produce up to 10 flowers in a cluster. We don't leave them all, certainly, all that fruit. Okay. Now, one of the most common questions that I get, and we get out at the Horticulture Center, are people, and that's why they come out there, they want to know what to do with their big trees, 25 feet tall, branches are breaking, what do you do with it? And that's so common because they move into a house that it wasn't taken care of, or they get busy, or they have an emotional breakdown and can't work on the tree for a while. It happens. So what do you do with it? All right, there's two ways. The typical way, the most standard method has been cut them to desired height. Let's say you want to bring it down to 8 feet, and it's right now 25 feet. You do it over a period of 3 years. So if you have a distance of, about 17 feet to cover, then you want to do 6 feet, 6 feet, and then 6 feet over 3 years. And as you're doing that, as you make the cuts into thicker wood, you're going to get a lot of vigorous regrowth. So in order to prevent shading the permanent wood that you're hoping to leave, you have to do some thinning of upright shoots in the summer to provide light for the lower fruiting wood and the lower branch wood. Okay, so it doesn't always work real well. This is an example of a master gardener. I put a newsletter article out saying I'd like an older tree to work with so I can get some pictures of it. It wasn't the best situation, but it's probably the most typical situation. This tree was planted and it wasn't cut. It may have been here, but I doubt it. probably there were 2 branches on it. She just left them both. They both grew. They grew longer and longer. Any side branches there were probably got shaded out, and then they were cut later when they died. All right, so you ended up with this tree with 1 lateral branch here, maybe 1 going back to the outside, and this is 6 feet right here. So the first branching doesn't start till 8 feet. Okay, and then you had this. It kept going higher and higher, got into the lines, and it was cut off here about 3 years before I took this picture, and ended up sunburning pretty badly up there, and I'll show you that. Then you had all this new growth that came, and it's too high to pick even with a ladder. So what do? Well, what would you do? Prune it. You could, okay, if you cut it back in thirds, take it out. That's actually what she did. She ended up taking it out just this year. Because you don't have anything to cut back to here. So you could cut the whole thing off here, and you have nothing to grow. You have no branches, except maybe this one over here. So what I did is I cut the top branches off to start with. All right? So just to go back, and it's not quite the same angle, but you get the idea. Those branches were cut. Of course, it's going to grow again, but the idea was to come back a few years later and then maybe cut it here, a few years later, and then cut it here. Unfortunately, I got busy and I didn't end up going back, but I don't think you could have worked with this tree very successfully because there's no shading, there's no branch work down here. That's not the end of the world, because you could cut these off and new shoots will start to grow, as I'll show you in a minute. But you could reshape it, but not without cutting into some big wood down there. This was the top of that tree, and you could see sunburn all up here. This was sunburn, really a problem. And there was a lot of disease problem up there, and borers, lots of borers. So if you're going to do that kind of cutting, you have to paint it white. But again, if it's 20 feet tall, it's kind of hard to get up there and paint it. But you can see the cuts I made here just to get rid of some of that. And there's still all this wood that's still too high to pick the fruit. Anyway, the second method, a little more drastic, is to bring down the height all in 1 year. Okay? So you're going to saw off the limbs well below the desired height, or just below the desired height of the tree. Because wherever you saw off the limbs, that's where the new branching is going to be. So if you want the desired height to be up here, you better cut the tree down here so you have a little room for branches. All right? But you don't cut off all the limbs, because you have a root system down there that's totally dependent on the photosynthesis products, the sugars, carbohydrates, that are moved down the tree and support the growth of the roots, support the roots. So if you cut all the branches off, the roots may die. The tree may die. So you want to leave one nurse limb to feed the roots. Okay? That's what we call it, a nurse limb. And you're thinning to new shoots. You're thinning new shoots out, so you're going to get a lot of new regrowth. You have to thin some of those to form a framework for your tree, the branching. And then to train the tree as desired from that point on, but I should have put this up here, paint exposed limbs white to prevent them from sunburn and borer damage. Yes?
When are you doing the grafting period?
Okay, what time of year?
Yeah.
Good question. If you did it in the summer, you'd have a problem with sunburn. Well, with white paint, it's not such an issue because it's not going to sunburn with white paint. It reflects the light and heat. If you did it in the middle of the winter, then you have a big wide opening for diseases to potentially enter into that cut. It's a wound on the tree. I like to wait until about now, March, April. Before the growth has really started, now is really the best time to do it. The rains have slowed down. Even if it rains, most of the spores have already been released, and the healing will take place really quickly on that wound, on that cut. So now is a good time. It's not a very good shot, but this is a big apple tree. I didn't know how to take a good picture because there was this tree over here. Anyway, you see it tall, branching at the top. You don't see the broken branches so much here, but on another tree that I did, the same age tree at another place, branches at the top are broken from the weight of the fruit. Okay, big tree, not for long. Different angle, but this is the tree, cut to, this is probably 4 or 5 feet here, maybe 6 at the most there. So it's pretty drastic, and you can see these branches that were left here. It doesn't have to be just one nurse limb, but you have to leave some branching, and this is on the north side, so sunlight is still going to get here. And it was painted white right after this, by the way. All this exposed wood here and the cut too, just to prevent it from burning. And this is what it looked like about a month later. And that was done a little earlier than now, probably mid-March. This was taken probably mid-April. So the buds have started growing through here. You don't see them too well, but they're little buds that are starting to grow. These branches were already here, so they're just producing new growth on the new branching. But it doesn't take long before those buds start growing right through that bark. And then you could start to form this, like for instance, it's growing straight up, but if you put a toothpick or some kind of spreader, you could get it to grow out, get this one to grow out. This one's already growing out. So you can start to form the framework of a new tree, and then you can keep it small. And this is what it looked like that summer. It just looks like a bush. But again, it's cut here still. It's going to look funny in the winter. It's a method that you can use that on apples, I can almost guarantee it'll work. On stone fruits, it may not. I've never tried it. I'd actually be interested if someone wants to try it, to give it a try. If someone has an old stone fruit tree, peach or apricot or plum, you can try it on. If you're interested in losing the tree, if otherwise. Okay, this is a situation in the yard where the plum tree had died. It was an old gnarly plum tree, and rootstock suckers had grown up. No fruit, or the fruit was very small. And there was one back here, and it was nice. It was shading this window, but there was no fruit. She really wanted fruit. So I came over and removed the tree. It was, well, maybe it was here, I can't remember, but cut off one, left the other. This one, I don't have pictures of it, but it later produced nice branches, shoots. And those shoots then we budded, or she budded, I guess. And of all the buds she grafted, I guess one took. That's all you need, though, to form the new tree. And then that bud, when it grows, the new shoot becomes the new tree. And after that, then this was cut off, or could be cut off. And then you have a new tree that's a good variety, and you have your shade, too. Now, this wouldn't work on this peach tree, even though it's got nice branching down here. These big trees are growing on the south side. And it doesn't work, because this tree has grown up so high, it's now reaching up and finally able to get a little bit of light when it gets beyond the branches of these trees in the back. It won't work here. It's going to be too shady. So just leave it as a shrub, a tree, a shade tree, if you can handle it. If you're going to have this kind of situation, just plant a shade tree and not a fruit tree. Okay, that's all I have about pruning. Talking now about fruit thinning, which is very, very important to do. If you don't fruit thin, then you'll have broken branches, you'll have maybe more disease or insect problems, and you'll have alternate bearing. The tree bears heavily in one year, nothing or very little in the next year, then heavily again. You can eliminate that cycle and get good big fruit by doing fruit thinning. So this is what it looks like before, and then after, you've removed at least half of the fruit. Oftentimes you remove, if there's enough fruit, you remove up to 3/4 of the fruit on the tree. So when you're finished, it looks like the floor, the orchard floor under the tree is green. And that's the way it should look, because people tend to not take enough fruit off. But if you remember, that fruit's going to get big, and they'll be spaced apart, so you don't have them touching. That's the main thing, not have them touching. And if it's a weak limb, thin a little heavier so the branch doesn't break. Of course, pruning is the first step in thinning. If you prune some of these, like peach shoots that get this long, cut it in half or a third off, then you have a shorter shoot, less to prune or less to thin, and the branch doesn't fall down, break, go downward and break. Okay, fruit thinning, there's a reason for it. This is the increasing number of fruit per tree going this direction. So you have, the more fruit you have, the greater your total yield. But the more fruit you have, the lower the smaller the fruit, lower the fruit size. Okay? There's a point at which you want it somewhere in this area where you get a good amount of fruit, but you want big fruit. If you thin to only one fruit, you're not going to have this big a fruit. You need to leave enough to get enough fruit on the tree. All right? But you don't want to leave so much that it weakens the tree and makes small fruit size. So, as you might guess now, the reasons for thinning: to increase fruit size, improve fruit color, reduces disease, especially brown rot, and it reduces alternate bearing, and it reduces limb breakage. Alternate bearing occurs because you have fruit on the tree in the summer, too much fruit, it's a drain on the tree, at the time when the flower buds are forming in the summer. So the tree doesn't have enough energy to put into forming flower buds for the next year. Okay, methods of thinning. Hand thinning is the most thorough but time consuming. It's the best method, but if you don't have time, you can't use it. Selectively eliminate the small and damaged fruit. So you eliminate all the fruit you don't want, but you can select especially those that are small or damaged. Then another method is to use some sort of a cluster buster, as I call it. It's a short hose piece on a mop handle, or you can use a fan belt, and I'll show you a couple of different methods. It's very quick, but it's not selective, not as selective. And it may damage the fruit also. Okay, these are different methods. This is the kind I use that I like. It's a wooden pole, generally a mop handle, is the same thickness as about a 5/8 inch hose. Take a piece of hose, you stick it over the end and put a nail on it, in it so it stays. And that hose piece is about, less than a foot long. And so it's kind of soft when it hits the fruit. Another method is to use a fan belt that's wrapped around a pole, and then you could sort of pull the fruit off. It's kind of nice. Another method, I've never tried it, is to use this wire thinner. But I kind of like banging, so you can bust a whole cluster. Like apricots, you'll get 50 fruit in one small area. You just take this thing and you get to where you can bang it just the right amount to knock off just the right amount of fruit. Sometimes you hit it a little too hard and you knock off all the fruit. Other times you don't hit it hard enough and too much fruit stays. Okay, the timing is when the fruit is about 3/4 to an inch in diameter. Usually it's late April for most stone fruits. For apples and pears, they ripen later, or they flower later. They're just coming out now. You would do them more like early May. The spacing depends on the tree vigor, but the fruit should not touch at harvest. So think about how big the fruit's going to get and thin accordingly. Peaches should be about 4 inches apart, apricots about 2 to 3 inches. Apples, thin them to 1 fruit per cluster, pears, 1 or 2 fruit per cluster. So you get a cluster of flowers and fruit. You want to thin off all but 1 or 2. Okay, there are problems you can have, like few or no flowers. If you have lack of chilling, like we see in some years, overcropping, severe pruning, or they're too young, they may not have many flowers. You may think about regrafting the variety. Some trees I've seen that just never have any flowers or fruit. Get rid of it or graft it over. Fruit drop, some is normal. Lack of pollination, worms, diseases, and drought, and fruit load can also cause fruit to drop. Small fruit is caused from overcropping, or it may be a rootstock sucker that's grown and the scion died, so you have rootstock producing fruit. The rootstock is not usually very good fruit. Usually it's small. Okay. Other problems are lack of flavor, and the variety could be a problem. You could have a variety that just doesn't taste good. You could be overwatering, which kind of dilutes the flavor. Or the tree is stressed. It could be a problem with flavor. Split pits or split fruit or split pits are a problem with variety. Maybe some varieties tend to split more. Generally, it's caused by dry versus followed by too much water all at once. And that can cause, the cells of the fruit grow quickly, and that causes the fruit to split. Okay, budding and grafting. We do budding and grafting for several reasons: to produce new fruiting tree off of a rootstock of a sucker, or of a dead, injured, or fruitless tree. That's what I talked about earlier. Or if you want to add a pollinizer to a variety that needs a pollinizer, instead of putting flowers in the tree, you could do that every year. Or you could graft or bud a pollinizer variety onto it. And you can make fruit salad trees with different types of fruits, although not all fruits are compatible with each other, of course. And you can make a tree or shrub with different colored flowers, like roses. And we've done that a little bit at the Horticulture Center. Now remember, if you take a seed and you plant it, you really like the fruit, you really want to grow that, you have to bud or graft it. Why? Because just like in humans, the fruit from the seed, the offspring, the tree that grows up, the fruit usually aren't quite as good, right? The offspring aren't usually ever quite as good, are they? No. But seriously, the fruit usually are smaller. Now in breeding, they do this. They breed flowers together and then they plant out many different seeds, at least that's the old method, and they test the trees to see those that have bigger fruit, because sometimes you get a bigger fruit, but it's rare. And then they select those that are the best fruits, and that's how we get new varieties, or at least used to. So if you have a tree that's not produced, if you have a tree that you really love the fruit on, you have to take a piece of that and put it on another tree, on your tree. It's the removal of a bud, tea budding now, of a desired variety and the insertion of that bud into the stalk, the rootstock or the stalk. It's easy and successful if you know how to do it. The spring, if you bud in the spring, the branch then grows for the current season. If you bud in the late summer, that bud will stay over winter and then will grow the next spring, but only if you cut off the branch above it to force it to grow. Use vigorous 1-year-old shoots, about 1/4 inch or more, and then after you've done the budding, you cut the branch 1/2 inch above the top of the bud to force the growth. And I'm going to go through this process here. This is what it looks like. You create a T by cutting into the bark only. There's the top of the T, and then a long line about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long. And then you peel it back. This happens when the bark is slipping, when the growth is occurring, spring, summer, early fall. And then you remove, on the other tree that you like, you take a shield of the bud off, you remove it from the wood, you kind of squeeze it and pull it off. You place it into your cut piece, your cut bark, and then you wrap it with a rubber band, and the bark wrapping over it seals it, so you don't have to wax it or anything. The rubber band just goes around, just needs to hold it tight, but you don't have to have it sealed. Okay, let's look at that process here. This is a budding knife, and this is a bark lifter on the back. It lifts the bark. If you use the blade, it would cut the bark. Okay, so the T-cut was made here and then down here, and now the bark lifter is pulling the bark away. And then the bark has been pulled away, the bud has been inserted, but not all the way yet. The top of the cut on the stalk is here, the top of the cut on the bud is here. We're going to push it all the way down so that the top of the bud shield matches or just underneath the top of the stalk cut, or the top of the T-cut. Not as easy as it looks, but with practice you can get it. And then we wrap it with a budding rubber band, or use just a regular rubber band that has been cut, but these rubber bands used for budding are stretchier than most thick rubber bands. And you can get those at Peaceful Valley Farm Supply or any, most farm supply stores will have them. And this is what it looks like later then. And it won't grow, just like these buds won't grow, until you've cut the top off, removing the influence of the oxen moving down the tree, and that allows the buds to then grow. Now, if you put a bud down here or anywhere on a tree, or you want to just force a branch to grow, instead of cutting it off, remember that the oxen moves down the phloem. I didn't tell you that, but it does. Down the phloem, which is the bark, moves down, and then if you somehow interrupt that downward movement by either cutting off the branch or notching, this is called notching, where you take a slice of the bark away. You remove a slice of the bark, either in a half circle, like this is one half circle that overlapped with this half circle. By doing this notching, it forced these buds to grow because it removed the influence of the oxen. And if you put a bud here, then it won't grow unless you either cut the branch or cut the bark somehow above it. And this is what it looked like in the winter. It heals over very quickly, but you have low branching then.
What happens about that?
It continues to grow. It's normal. Now, removing the bark strip doesn't hurt the water flow upward. If you cut into the wood, then the xylem, then you would influence the top. You'd kill the top. Okay, another is whip grafting. Whip grafting is done by taking the stalk of about at least 1/4 inch thick wood, 1-year-old, and you're removing, or you're cutting a slice down at an angle, and then you cut straight down with a knife about 1/4 inch or so. And then you take the scion and do the same thing. You make the same cut, and it's about 1/3 the way from the tip of that cut, all right? And then you place this in there, and it forms a tongue and groove connection, and that is usually successful as long as the cambium layers match up, the bark layers match up. Then you put it together. You can't see the slice very well, but then you wrap it, and this you do have to keep moist because it'll dry out if you don't wrap it and wax it. Okay, that's done in the late winter is the best time.
Do you leave the bark on the scion piece that goes down, the tongue that
Yeah.
goes in?
You leave the bark.
You don't peel it? Okay.
You don't peel any bark back at all.
Okay.
That's why it can be done in the winter, because the bark has to be slipping for budding. But this, you're just cutting the wood.
Okay.
What did you mean by wax? You said keep it moist and wax?
Right. You have to keep the union where you've just made moist, and you have to either, keep it from losing water. So there's grafting wax that you can put over that. First you put tape around it, then you put wax to keep it from drying out. And then it'll form the union, and then by the time the wax breaks its connection or starts to break, then it will already have formed the connection. Okay, whip grafting is the removal of 1-year-old shoot of the desired variety and insertion into the stalk, tongue and groove. It's done before bud swell, late winter, usually early February is a good time. 1-year-old wood, and you match the size of the stalk and scion, and use an angled cut 1 to 1.5 inches long. I could have put this first, this whole text slide, but now you have a really good idea what I'm talking about, so I put the text slides afterwards. But sorry, because you probably spent all that time writing all this down. Then you put a vertical cut 1/3 the distance from the cut tip, and then put them together. Okay, citrus trees. Standard can grow to 20 or more feet tall, and dwarf can grow to 6 to 10 feet tall. Meyer lemon actually is not a true lemon. It was discovered in China in 1908 by a man, and of course he named it after himself. Citrus Meyeri, it's called. It's not a true lemon. Just an interesting point there. Okay, citrus are shallow rooted, 1 to 3 feet max. They require good drainage. They avoid heavy clay soils unless you have good drainage. Use raised beds or containers if the soil is poor. And provide plenty of water because citrus are not very drought tolerant. Okay, this is an orchard shot, and this was good, nice, uniform soil, good depth. But all the roots are in the top 1 to 3 feet. It's really interesting. There was no hard pan layer here. It's just that the citrus roots are shallow rooted. Citrus are shallow rooted. You see a few deep roots every once in a while, and they will, but mostly in the really top portion of the soil. Little pruning is required, mostly shaping, and removal of dead wood, or removal of vigorous water sprouts. The timing, early spring after frost is best, and the reason for that is after the frost period, you have this growth up above it that will protect the lower wood from frost damage. And then if you remove it after frost damage, then the new growth starts now, at this time of year. Head or remove strong upright shoots. Keep the skirts, they're called, pruned up off the ground. Tall trees, reduce the height over 3 years again, whitewash exposed limbs, and I'm sure you could do the same method of reducing it all in 1 year. Because citrus have a thin bark, they will grow pretty readily from a major cut. You can prune fairly severely to reshape and invigorate the tree. Okay, this is an orchard down in Tulare County, and just to show you, they hedge here. They use this pretty serious hedger. They use the same thing with regular pruning shears. And so they keep it boxed pretty well because they're narrow spacing, but they keep it really well hedged here. And on top also they have the same kind of cutters that come along the top. Most of us don't have equipment like this, so we have to do it manually. They also have these skirt cutters, sickle bar cutter here, that just prunes off the lower branches and the lower fruit. You don't want it touching the ground. You could prevent some what's called brown rot. It's a different brown rot than stone fruits get by keeping the fruit off the ground.
So like a foot up?
Yeah, a foot up is a good amount. Okay, frost hazard, of course, is a big issue. And this is at the Horticulture Center. Our trees got frosted the first year they were in, pretty darn badly. Or maybe the second year they were in. But they lived. This was pretty severe in here, but the lower wood was alive. So if you wait until the spring, then you can see if the tree is really dead. A lot of times you think, oh, it's dead, let's just get it out of there. Wait till May even, because those buds can start growing pretty late in the season. Some people use some pretty creative methods of keeping their trees warm. Now on a real serious freeze, this wouldn't do anything. But for frost, certainly this is a good protection method, but you don't need to wrap it like a Christmas present. Some people, this was a shot that's kind of blurry, but what this is Christmas lights, and it's inside of a canopy. Christmas lights are warm, they keep a tree warm, and if you have a little plastic over them, it can prevent them from getting frosted. Or if you have a serious freeze, like a 4-day freeze come in, or it gets into the upper teens, this can keep your trees alive. Pretty unusual looking. Just quickly to show you, there are differences in the varieties, or species I should say, on how hardy they are to cold. The limes tend to be very sensitive, and this is any number of hours that gets to that temperature, you can lose branches or whole trees. And kumquats, mandarins, oranges tend to be more frost tolerant. Okay? And then the citrus fruit, that was the trees, and the citrus fruit are also differences. When they're green, they're more susceptible. When they're ripe, they're a little more tolerant. That's all I really want to say about that. Okay, this is all you have to remember. Just go out there and spray, spray, spray. This is the old way. And this is really old because these guys aren't using any protection, which is really a no-no now. You never do something like this. And we're trying to avoid spraying at all, really. So some of the more important pests I've covered here, codling moth. This is the moth. It's about about 3/8 of an inch long. Pretty small. You never see the moth. You just see the worm damage. And this is what they look like in a cluster. I won't explain what I was doing here. We had a petri dish full of them. They were sterilized. This is the egg and the larva beginning to emerge. And then this is what it looks like in the dormant season. Now, codling moth goes into the apple. Before the apple falls off the tree, or pear, the worm moves out of the apple onto the tree and then moves downward. And it pupates on a crevice on the tree. And this is a pupa, so any spray you do in the dormant season won't do a bit of good. It has to be in-season control only. And this is what it looks like in the fruit. And I think that's the worm in there. It's kind of a bad picture. But it damages the fruit. You can cut the fruit and eat only the good portion. You can lose all the fruit on the tree, which is typical in most situations because codling moth will just nail your fruit. You cannot get any fruit at all because of it. It's mainly a pest of apple and pear, but also walnut and quince, walnut to a lesser extent. They overwinter as larvae in cocoons. The mating begins during flowering, and we're talking about the point when mating begins in pears now because I work with the pear orchards. And it's probably going to be this weekend. Early April, late March, early April is usually when it occurs. Mating starts. 3 generations per season, and they're very, very difficult to control, especially organically. The control methods are take what you get and cut the damage out, which most people do. Remove or destroy the infested fruit early. Before the larva has emerged from the fruit, if you take that fruit off and cut it open or just throw the fruit away, then you will kill that cycle. But if you wait till the fruit drops on the ground, it's too late. Bag individual fruits early in the season. Put a paper bag around it. And this is all discussed in the pest note on codling moth. It's pretty labor intensive though. Mass trapping of males can be done. Pheromone confusion we do in the orchards. Virtually all the pear and apple orchards now, they use pheromone confusion. Summer oil sprays can be used, but every 7 to 10 days to really be effective. And then a chemical that's used is 7. It used to be diazinon, but now it's ended up in the stream, so we can't use it. And 7, kills beneficial insects and probably has other problems. So generally, I'm trying to tell people, and I'd like you to tell people, use other methods than these chemicals. There are other methods, but it takes more labor. A lot of people and older people are used to going out and spraying every 3 or 4 weeks, and that does a pretty good job, but you're spraying, it's toxic, there are problems with it. This is pheromone confusion, which I won't go into. I've talked about borers, and they're a pretty serious problem, but only if you don't have good cultural practices and pruning practices. The 2 main ones that we have here, flat-headed borers, which you usually don't see the adult, but he's sitting right there. It's a beetle. And the grub, or the larva, burrows in and then forms these tunnels underneath the bark. But it can kill whole branches, it can kill whole trees. We have them in landscape trees and shrubs also. Some species, like junipers, tend to be pretty susceptible to borers, but usually trees, and another one is alders, various other trees get borers pretty badly, but usually they get borers when they're stressed, under some kind of stress. And that's the larva. It has this wide head. Anybody ever seen these? If you cut into a borer-infested branch, then you can often find these if it's early enough, like in the summertime, early summer. But later in the summer, they will have pupated and moved on. Another one is shot-hole borer. That's what the adult looks like. And what you get is these, like a shotgun blast to a tree. You get these little holes, and that's shot-hole borer. If you take off the bark, you get these tunnels all over the place, and it'll kill a tree. But usually, again, only in the case of sunburn or an unhealthy tree, a stressed tree. So borers, again, the most important species that we have to deal with are Pacific flat-headed and shot-hole. Control methods are keep the trees healthy and prevent sunburn by painting new trees and exposed branches white, and use proper dormant and summer pruning techniques. That's it. There used to be lindane. Anybody remember lindane? But obviously it was a very toxic chemical. It's not around anymore. And anything you try to apply to the tree, it's not going to get the larva that's inside there. So some chemicals are used by landscapers and nursery people for clear-winged moth, and they put traps out to determine when they're flying and mating. Then shortly after that, they'll put the chemical on the tree trunk, and that when the moth lays its egg there, the larva is killed by the chemical. That's not really available to homeowners. It's only a specialized thing for nurseries when they know they're going to have a problem. Okay, fire blight. Very serious problem on many different rosaceous plants. This is really characteristic, but you don't see this all that often. On these young vigorous shoots, 1-year-old current season shoot, in about May, you'll see oozing right from the shoot. And then you'll see oozing, like right here, on the pear, in this case, or apple, pyracantha, or many others. And then you get this blackening, which is why they call it fire blight, because it looks like a fire has burned the leaves. It turns black. And not always black, usually more like brown, but sometimes totally black. And this shoot here and this shoot here have been infected, probably right down here, and it's moved up. Or it could have occurred down up in here. Maybe there was a flower. Well, there wouldn't be a flower on a 1-year-old shoot, right, in pear, because they produce flowers on spurs or 2-year-old branches. Anyway, one thing you can notice here is this crook on the top. That's pretty characteristic because you had an actively growing shoot tip, and it's very limber, so if it stopped getting water, like if it died from fire blight, it would bend over before it turns brittle, and that's why you have a crook on the top of those. Sometimes that's how you can diagnose whether it's fire blight or not. And then you get these cankers from about here down to here, and this is all dead wood. If you were to cut it open, you would find that early on, when it's first infected, the branch, it's sort of reddish underneath, and the real giveaway is if you smell it, and it smells like sort of a fermenting sweet odor. But it's real characteristic. Anytime I see something that might be fire blight, first thing I do is cut a slice off the branch, and smell it. Look at it and smell it. Real characteristic. Most bacterial diseases are characteristic in that way. And even the flowering fruit trees, flowering pear, in this case, this is a Bradford pear, got fire blight. And you can see this is completely dead now, and this, the leaves are still on it, and it's probably all infected. Okay, the characteristics are, it's a bacteria, it enters through the flowers under warm and moist conditions. It affects apple, pear, especially Bartlett pear. Bartlett pear, horrible. Asian pears, many Asian pear varieties are very susceptible. Flowering pear, not quite as susceptible, but it will get it in a bad fire blight year, like we had 2 years ago. 2000, the year of 2000 was a notorious fire blight year for apple and pear growers throughout the whole state, at least the northern portion of it. The conditions were just right for so long that it produced an epidemic. It was very, very bad. And some of you may have seen it on your own trees. Quince also, loquat, pyracantha, and hawthorn. They all get fire blight. Control methods. The main method is to cut the shoot or branch 12 inches below the infection zone. And the reason is, especially on young, actively growing wood, you see it's oozing or black here. What you don't see is that the bacteria has already moved down here. You just can't see any sign of it. So you want to go 12 inches, at least 12 inches below any sign of it. And then sterilize your shears between the cuts. Especially if it's moist, like raining or foggy, that is the worst condition. If it's really dry, generally, growers don't bother sterilizing because you can't transmit it if it's dry. And then you sterilize using a 20% solution of Clorox. Clorox is 10% sodium hypochlorite, and then you're using a 20% solution of that. And you also want to use old clothes when you use this because it will cause drops all over your clothes. Another method is to spray copper twice during the blooming period. Now the growers use antibiotics, streptomycin, terramycin mainly, and they're very effective, although not 100%, but we don't have antibiotics to use. We use them on us, but not on the trees. Homeowners, retail, no antibiotics are sold. So copper is really all that we have, copper products. So that's what you would use.
Can you give a name of one, or is it?
Microcop, Maxi-Cop, or I think Fixed Copper, various names, various companies. Okay, that's fire blight. Shot hole disease is another one we don't usually think of. I don't usually until you see it in the office. Someone will bring it in and you won't really know what it is, but it's a pretty bad picture, but you see a spot here, a spot here, a spot here. And on the leaves, they're infected also with spots. And it's really prominent on apricots, but also on peaches and nectarines. Has anybody ever seen it? A little bit? Okay. It also infects the twigs. And here you see a lesion and oozing on the twig. Okay, before I talk much more about that, peach leaf curl is actually very similar, at least in terms of how we control it. So peach leaf curl, most of you have seen it, causes reddening, sometimes white, and puckering of the leaves. Starting to see it now. We saw it in the horticulture center a little bit. Some varieties are very susceptible. Others are sold as resistant to peach leaf curl, which is great. If you can get a good tasting variety that's resistant, more power to you. This is a different shot of it. And it affects the fruit also. But mostly it's a problem of the leaves. Shot hole affects peaches and nectarines and apricots, but not plums. Now some of you say, I've got a plum. Every year it gets holes in it, just like shot hole. You're telling me shot hole doesn't affect plums? What the plums get is physiological problem. It's not a pathogen. It's not caused by the shot hole fungus. So with plums, don't bother spraying copper or anything else for shot hole because they don't get it. It won't. You can spray all the copper you want. It's not going to help it. Peach leaf curl, though, affects only peaches and nectarines. They are fungal diseases that are spread by rain and wind, the spores are. And the spores overwinter in buds and twigs. That's why the control method is dormant season spraying. The copper penetrates into the buds and kills the spores. So control is for both diseases a late November spray, usually Thanksgiving. Usually people say Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Valentine's Day, just the times you don't want to be out spraying, but those are the times that are easy to remember it. I would give up the Christmas spray because you don't need it. So late November is when you would normally spray to control shot hole disease. But it also helps with peach leaf curl. And you use fixed copper or basic copper sulfate, any product that has it on the label. For peach leaf curl, then also spray copper or lime sulfur in February as the flower buds begin to swell. Now, those buds in the early dormant season are enclosed pretty tightly in bud scales, and it's hard to get a spray in there. So if you wait until the best timing is actually as those buds are starting to swell, the scale have come apart, and you can easily penetrate into the buds.
Do you use a sticker or a sprayer?
Do you use a sticker? Yes, you use a sticker, definitely. Usually, like micro-cop is sold with the chemical, the copper, and a sticker attached to one container. 2 containers in one. Okay, and if it rains right after you apply the copper, it's probably best to apply it again. Now, Bordeaux is a different thing slightly. Bordeaux has hydrated lime that's been added to it, and that causes it to sort of turn into cement. So if you spray Bordeaux mixture on the trees, it won't wash off too easily, unless it rains right after you spray it, which you would want to try to avoid. So Bordeaux, you hear people talking about Bordeaux, but it's slightly, and it's sold, but you normally, to make Bordeaux, you mix the copper sulfate with hydrated lime. Brown rot. It affects the twigs, it moves into the flowers, kills twigs. Sometimes it can kill all the twigs on the tree, most of them, which are the fruiting spurs. And it can also attack the fruit, and that's what we usually see. And it starts as a little brown spot, gets bigger and bigger. In a few days, it's almost completely surrounded the whole fruit. And at the end of the season, those fruit that remain on the tree turn into what we call mummies, and those mummies become the spore mechanism to release spores to infect new flowers the next year. So you definitely want to remove those mummies. If you haven't done so by now, well, it may be too late by now. Okay, it's a fungal fungus. The spores enter through the flowers and kill the spurs. It attacks fruit during ripening, and control is not necessary in most years. In fact, I usually don't control it at all. But some years, like El Nino in 1998, we had rain all through the spring, and it caused a lot of brown rot. So that would have been a good time to spray. But you can't always predict if it's going to be a wet spring. But you remove the mummies and thin the fruit, and then if you're interested in spraying, you don't always have to certainly, use a copper spray at bud swell. And that also is used for peach leaf curl. And then more importantly, use 1 to 2 copper sprays during bloom, just like with fireblend.
The preceding program was part 2 of 2 parts, each part an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time that other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.